Well, I've never thought of it like that. I've never looked at myself as in what position with the other artists. I just look at my own career, and if it's doing well, why, I'm satisfied, you know.
Roy Orbison was expected to make a triumphant return in the 1980s. He still possessed that remarkable voice, but he also had new songs and prominent pals. A number of DJs lost their jobs after attempting to play his songs. Threats were leveled against record retailers that carried his music. The reality was that Roy's career was on the line because he had betrayed radio's most perilous gatekeeper. They deliberately withheld this information from you. Vernon, Texas was the site of Roy Orbison's birth on April 23, 1936. At the height of America's darkest hour, he watched while his father, an oil field worker, battled for employment. Despite his mother's artistic bent, she struggled financially. They had to always be on the go, seeking employment opportunities wherever they could. They relocated to Fort Worth in 1942 in search of manufacturing opportunities made available by the war. Their final destination was Wink, Texas, which Roy would later characterize as dusty, greasy, and full of nothing. Nevertheless, these formative years had an impact on him. His music reflected the resilience of his long line of survivors. At the age of 6, Roy's world shifted. Even though it was only a toy, his father's gift of a guitar was the spark that ignited a fire within him. Music swiftly became his life's focus once he acquired the basics from his father and older brother. Roy practiced by himself as the other children played outdoors. Even at the tender age of 7, he had already decided what he wanted to accomplish with his life. The music of Lefty Frizzell, Hank Williams, and Jimmie Rodgers captivated him. Slow, emotive notes, which would later become his hallmark, began to shape his approach at an early age. Texas was hit hard by a polio epidemic in 1944. The thought of Roy and his brother being taken away by their terrified parents caused them to return to Vernon and reside with their grandma. His reserved personality was exacerbated by his early separation from his parents. Roy began to experiment with black hair color as a child in an effort to alter his appearance. He had low self-esteem and felt the need to do so. He didn't consider himself very athletic or talented, and he thought his voice was his one redeeming quality. Not because he believed it was particularly outstanding, he only assumed that it would be remembered. His whole life, he would have that modest demeanor. One of his early major moments followed. The village was visited by a traveling medical show in the summer of 1946. Roy joined a talent contest at the tender age of 10. To everyone's amazement, he sang 2 songs, Joel Blon and Mountain Dew, and he tied for first place with a 15-year-old. He realized at that point that his voice was enjoyed by strangers as well as his family. A sense of self-assurance he had never before felt washed over him. These days, making music was more than simply a pastime, it was a platform. He created his first band, the Wink Westerners, and began performing on KFYO radio in Kermit, Texas, when he was 15 years old. In fact, they hosted their own radio program, where they played a wide variety of music, including country and big band favorites. Even though Roy continued to put his music first, he did hard summer tasks like painting water towers and cutting steel. After breaking up with the Wink Westerners in 1955, Roy established a new band called the Teen Kings and dropped out of college. After landing a TV spot in Odessa, they shot to fame among locals. In the course of one of their performances, Roy met the woman who would eventually become his wife, Claudette Frady. In a modest studio in New Mexico, they produced their debut single, Ooby Dooby, in the same year. The album came out on a little label, but that wouldn't be the case for much longer. This is where the story becomes murky. Rumors have it that Johnny Cash instructed Roy to get in touch with Sun Records, the label from which Elvis gained his start. However, Sam Phillips of Sun Records and Roy's own drummer both deny that to be true. They say Phillips got the contract after a record store owner played Ooby Dooby for him over the phone. Sun Records signed the Teen Kings, and they re-recorded Ooby Dooby in Memphis. That much is certain. Although the song became their first major hit, issues were brewing behind the scenes. Ballads, Roy's preferred musical style, are those that evoke strong feelings. But Sun Records was looking for more rockabilly, more songs in the vein of Elvis. That was not the case with Roy. Instead of Roy, Sam Phillips was looking at Carl Perkins. However, with Perkins's accident clearing the decks at the label, Roy's Ooby Dooby was given a chance to shine. No more singles were released by the artist. However, it did reach the Billboard charts and sold over 200,000 copies. The band, in an effort to maintain its relevance, embarked on a tour with an unconventional twist, performing on the rooftops of drive-in cinemas in the intermissions of their films. In an effort to elicit applause from the audience, Roy swung around the stage like Elvis. Because they only had one hit album, they tried all they could to win praise, he once stated. It was a period of optimism, perseverance, and challenging experiences. The release of Only the Lonely in 1960 revolutionized the music industry and Roy Orbison's career. He originally approached Elvis and the Everly Brothers about releasing the song, but they declined. The most beneficial event in his life was actually that rejection. He did the recording himself, and it was immediately apparent that this was no ordinary rock and roll. With the backup voices front and center and the instrumentation muted, Roy's voice reached great heights, brimming with vulnerability and anguish. That was an unusual sound. Roy wasn't like other male artists of his day who sought to come out as intimidating and macho. His tone was one of profound sadness, and I felt its beauty for the very first time. Ever since then, he has continued to pen his own rules. Nearly all of his most popular songs were either written by him or co-written with Joe Melson, and subsequently with Bill Dees. Roy composed music that deviated from conventional structures. While most people stuck to the verse-chorus-verse format, Roy let his imagination run wild. Unexpected twists and turns in songs like In Dreams and Crying didn't detract from their effectiveness. The songs sounded genuine. Roy was more concerned with feelings than with mathematical equations. That was the thing that really set his music apart. The iconic photo, with its dark attire, sunglasses, and eerie silence, wasn't intentional. There was dread. Bad stage fright was Roy's worst fear. He wore his prescription sunglasses instead of his usual spectacles on one trip, they aiding in the concealment of his eyes and nerves. They remained on his person. Wearing the dark attire that followed gave him a sense of security, as if he were disguising himself. On stage, he hardly flexed. According to George Harrison, Roy looked like marble frozen except for his lips. However, the fact that Roy was motionless really enhanced the strength of his voice. It was genuine emotion, not a stage production. When he performed with the Beatles on their 1963 UK tour, that honest emotion was the showstopper. He was set to be the main attraction, but the Beatles were gaining popularity rapidly. But night after night, Roy would take the stage first, shocking the crowd. At first, he sang so softly that everyone had to fall silent to hear. After that, those enormous high notes were totally his. Even after he stepped off the platform, people continued to sing his name, forcing Lennon and McCartney to intervene and prevent him from returning. It was so difficult for even the Beatles to keep up with him on that trip. As Roy composed "Oh, Pretty Woman" in silence on the bus, Paul McCartney started penning "All My Loving." The mutual regard between them was genuine. He was so impressive that even Elvis was impressed. In 1955, Roy, wanting to know why everyone was so excited, drove all the way to see Elvis perform live. Although Roy was first unimpressed by Elvis's accent and humor, the King became one of his most ardent admirers once Roy achieved fame. He bought a whole box of records to gift to friends when Elvis's song "Only the Lonely" became popular. Elvis introduced Roy on stage at one of their final Vegas encounters by referring to him as the greatest singer in the world. However, Roy was never one to accept the hype. Deep down, he was never sure of anything. His music spoke volumes about him. That is the unique quality that set "Oh, Pretty Woman" apart. It was a casual remark. "A pretty woman never needs any money," Bill Dees remarked, and Roy quickly reached for his guitar. 40 minutes later, they had the song written. Claudette, Roy's wife, said that she was going shopping. After dethroning the Beatles from the charts, it became his most successful single, selling millions of copies. As far as the world was concerned, Roy Orbison was briefly unrivaled. That was a moment that reverberated worldwide. In Ireland, he was revered as more than just a celebrity. Roy returned again and time again, even though most American musicians had already left the nation. The Irish police had to cancel many of his concerts due to the violent crowds that threatened to attack the stage. In order to be closer to his fans, he even crossed dangerous borders during a politically unstable time to play 2 complete concerts in separate nations on the same day. A week later, he repeated the process. He felt the same way about Ireland. He accompanied the Rolling Stones on their inaugural 1965 tour of Oceania. It was an unusual combination, but the Stones' untamed energy and Roy's eerie songs worked. From Sydney to Perth, they performed in various cities every day. It was a terrible tour, but Roy endured it. Roy refused to back down, even though the British invasion ruined the careers of several American performers. He achieved a feat never before seen in the UK. He peaked at #1 twice in 1963 and 1964. His uniqueness was his undeniable secret. Roy remained still as everyone else danced and yelled. He wept as others bragged. He maintained his authenticity rather than attempting to compete. He stood out because of that. However, a turning point occurred at that same time. He secured a massive deal with MGM in 1965 after leaving Monument Records, the label that had influenced his sound. It appeared to be a wise decision. He would produce films, increase album output, and achieve unprecedented success. There were too many songs, too little time, and too many albums every year requested under the agreement. His private life, meantime, was far from ideal. Roy first crossed paths with Claudette Frady in the early 1950s. Roy, who was 21, and Claudette, who was perhaps as young as 15, tied the knot in 1957. Behind closed doors, the young couple was already shouldering the burden of adult duties, even if the public was just beginning to hear his name. Roy bought a showy pink Cadillac with his songwriting profits to mark the birth of his first son. That happiness was fleeting. They had to return to Roy's parents' house since they were bankrupt. He hit a wall in his musical career and even stopped playing for a little. Their next attempt at a new beginning was a relocation to Tennessee, where they had another son. The mayhem of trying to make it big, though, left them little breathing space. By 1963, the tide had turned. For no apparent reason, Roy became famous all over the world overnight. Teenage females were removed from him by the cops as his name was yelled out by fans from London to Sydney. But with fame came temptation. Claudette was alone in Hendersonville, raising their children, while Roy was leading a double life as a touring musician. A letter from one of his girlfriends hit Claudette like a ton of bricks when she discovered the truth. Those closest to Roy saw through his charade of a clean image. He was succumbing to the same rock star lifestyle he'd vowed to leave behind. He and a companion even maintained a schedule to keep track of the women they were meeting while touring London. A way of life was at stake, not merely a handful of slip-ups. Claudette remained at home, all alone and young, while Roy went in search of fame and other diversions. At that point, she crossed paths with Braxton Dixon, the builder of their home. Legendary in his native Tennessee, he built mansions for country music greats like Johnny Cash and Tammy Wynette. Claudette found herself more enchanted by the artistic energy he brought into their home on a daily basis. She only wished to be noticed again, according to her friends. Whenever Roy was absent, Dixon would step in, always present, pleasant, and actively involved. The emotional void that Roy had left behind was filled via their affair, which went beyond a mere sexual one. Everything fell apart in 1964. It seems like Roy and Claudette were finally apart after their divorce. Roy, nevertheless, made a dramatic shift when he inked a massive deal with MGM, which called for reduced traveling and more domestic performance. After then, their third son was born to Claudette. They reconciled and remarried by year's end 1965, after just a few months apart. After Roy's foot was broken in a motorbike accident, Claudette even took a flight to Britain. After everything they had been through together, they gave love another go, praying it would endure. Yet, that second opportunity would be short-lived. While enjoying a rare day off, Roy and Claudette were riding motorbikes together on June 6, 1966. Elvis had gotten them into motorcycling, and they loved it. However, while riding down a peaceful Tennessee road, a pickup vehicle abruptly pulled over. Even if Claudette didn't swerve, Roy did. It had a devastating effect. Holding her as she lay dying, Roy hurried back. No one could do anything about it. The 24-year-old lady, who had written the lyrics to one of his most popular songs, passed away while he held her. Roy was devastated. His friends reported he was speechless and ghostly throughout the burial. Still unable to stand the stillness in their home, he resorted to music, as he usually did. Every note was infused with his anguish as he recorded in the studio. There was now a darker undertone to his speech, which was already unsettling. Tragic songs like "Too Soon to Know" were the honest admissions of a guy who had experienced complete and utter despair. Claudette was not the only one who suffered misfortune. Albums, singles, and pictures were never a break for Roy thanks to his deal with MGM. His music fell in quality and popularity as he struggled to stay afloat. The situation was exacerbated since he was coerced into participating in the film The Fastest Guitar Alive by MGM. His great break in Hollywood was ruined by a terrible screenplay. Even though Roy was playing a spy with a guitar rifle, the film ended up being a comedy, and he wasn't ready to act as he was still mourning. After only one box office bomb, the proposed series was scrapped because critics were so unimpressed. Everything was going wrong, and this was just another proof of it. Then, the most devastating hit occurred. On September 14, 1968, Roy Orbison had recently concluded a performance in Birmingham and England. His house in Tennessee burnt down, and his two eldest kids were dead. The news would shatter any man. The audience adored him, but he was brought aside immediately after leaving the stage and delivered the news. At first, Roy didn't take the comments seriously. Eventually, he did, and he passed out in his dressing room. This comes after he tragically lost his wife in a motorbike collision just 2 years ago. All noise had faded from his life. He abruptly halted the remainder of the tour and returned to the U.S. in a flash, although the journey back seemed to go on forever. He could do nothing except ponder and mourn. There was no house in Hendersonville. All he could see when he arrived was a chimney covered in ash from a fire. His grandsons, Roy Duane, 10, and Anthony, 6, had been playing with fire while they were under their care. The legend goes that all it took was a lighter and a spray can. Whatever transpired, it transpired very rapidly. Wesley, their youngest sibling, was rescued at the last possible moment. However, an explosion of flames sent Roy's parents flying as they attempted to save the others. When rescuers finally showed up, it was already too late. Silence spoke louder than words during the funeral. At Roy's side were Johnny Cash and June Carter. Silence was their choice. They chose not to speak. The burden he bore was obvious to everybody. After selling the property to Johnny Cash in 1969, Roy was unable to bring himself to rebuild on the site due to the sad emotions associated with it. Johnny Cash made a holy vow, promising not to construct a home there. A fruit orchard, a living memorial to Roy's lads, was his alternative. After tending to the orchard for a while, Wesley found it to be a peaceful retreat whenever he needed it. Johnny Cash's home would also burn down years down the road. Much though nobody was hurt, the unexplained coincidence made an already terrifying tale much more so. For very some time, Roy was unable to recover. Not at all. He stopped composing music, moved in with his parents, and cut himself off from the outside world. Roy remained absorbed in contemplation, even during Johnny Cash's visit. Going forward, he was at a loss. His music had always been a release, but he no longer felt fulfilled by it. Psychedelic rock was already dominating the music industry, so Roy's heartfelt songs were becoming irrelevant. His album sales crashed. Nothing came of the $1 million agreement he had previously inked with MGM. Roy Orbison was practically unheard of by the early 1970s. He had a hard fall. He was unstoppable in the early 60s, when he was considered one of rock's best voices alongside Elvis. However, his venues were mostly deserted by 1976. In a vast arena, he played for a small crowd on his 40th birthday. One music reviewer had to place a special order for his recordings because they were so difficult to obtain, even in New York. Fans in faraway places like Bulgaria, too, celebrated for him as if the 60s had never ended. Even in the depths of despair, a glimmer of hope emerged. While on tour in the United Kingdom in 1968, Roy met Barbara, a German lady of 18 years of age. The next year, they tied the knot, and Roy Jr. and Alexander were born into their union. But he quietly and permanently severed ties with his family when he decided to leave his only son from his previous marriage, Wesley, in the care of his parents. A pivotal role in Roy's life, Barbara went on to assist him in reviving his career in the 1980s. Unfortunately, things didn't end there. During a Hawaiian vacation in 1977, Roy visited the emergency room due to chest trouble. 3 obstructed arteries were found by the doctors. Everyone told him he was fortunate to be alive. He continued smoking, eating badly, and touring regularly after undergoing triple bypass surgery. Despite expectations, the panic did not serve as a watershed moment. It was only a caution that he disregarded. Roy Orbison's career was on the decline by the mid-1980s. Strange things started to happen, though, when director David Lynch, renowned for his bizarre and disturbing films, used Orbison's haunting song In Dreams in Blue Velvet, shocking audiences. The song, which had before been sweet and lovely, now played at a terrifying incident in the film. The violent lunatic played by Dennis Hopper grew fixated on it. Orbison was first enraged because no one had sought his approval, and because he felt betrayed by having his music associated with something so sinister. Yet, as time progressed, a shift occurred. A new generation went crazy for the film, and soon enough, everyone was curious about the guy behind the voice. Orbison ultimately replied, "Okay, I get it." After viewing the film many times, he even re-recorded the song with Lynch's assistance. In an instant, he was back in the limelight. There was no fading of the spotlight. The next year, in 1987, Orbison took the stage at Los Angeles' Coconut Grove nightclub. Hollywood heavyweights such as Christopher Guest, Patrick Swayze, and David Lynch were in attendance, making this no ordinary performance. In homage, everyone were present. The admiration moved Orbison to tears. Los Angeles was rocked by an earthquake the following morning, causing chandeliers to fall and the arena to tremble. The concert's master tapes, however, managed to stay intact. An enchanted time capsule, that performance was subsequently released as Black and White Night. Unreleased film unearthed years later showed Orbison and his band doing an encore that was kept hidden until after the audience had departed. The night seemed reluctant to come to a close. After what seemed like the peak of excitement during that concert, something even more surprising occurred. George Harrison enlisted the help of pals Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Roy Orbison in 1988 when he needed a B-side for a single. The Traveling Wilburys were born out of a spontaneous jam session that took place in Dylan's garage. They weren't merely a band, they were a legendary ensemble that happened to be in the same place at the same moment. They constructed an entire album out of a single tune named Handle with Care, since it was too amazing to be hidden. Orbison paid tribute to his hero, Lefty Frizzell, by identifying as Lefty Wilbury. Their music was fantastic, and they joked and laughed a lot. The record catapulted Orbison back into the forefront of contemporary rock and sold millions of copies. During this time, Orbison started recording new music after signing with Virgin Records. He formed a partnership with the hit-making Jeff Lynne, who was already working with George Harrison. Orbison was much appreciated by Lynne, who thought his voice was wonderful. Tom Petty, Bono, and even Elvis Costello were all involved in the making of Mystery Girl, Orbison's last great record. There was a lot of passion and intensity throughout the meetings. While Orbison was recording A Love So Beautiful at George Harrison's mansion one night, her voice resounded like a dream. They were all aware they were seeing something extraordinary. A bitter twist, though, was in store for fate. Orbison passed out at his mother's house on December 6, 1988, a few weeks after completing Mystery Girl and before the Traveling Wilburys record came out. The ambulance raced him to the hospital, but he never arrived. At 52 years old, he was far from old. The impact was tremendous. His audience, his voice, and his legacy were all his again. Even after passing away, Roy Orbison continued to astound people. The single, You Got It, was released on January 3, 1989, which was less than a month after he passed away. It was his first top 10 single in over 25 years, and it rose quickly in the charts. Just 17 days before to his death, he gave the sole live version of the song that has ever been recorded, in Belgium. Officially, that video served as the music video. It was exquisite, it was eerie, and it was the end. Upon its release in January 1989, Mystery Girl was a commercial and critical success. Orbison's voice remained unspoiled by the passage of time. It was strong, moving, and memorable. Songs such as She's a Mystery to Me contributed to the album's platinum status by garnering universal acclaim. He was the only one for whom Bono had composed the title tune. Most critics agreed that it was his finest effort in decades. The Way Is Love was released in 2014 on the album's 25th anniversary, featuring his son's musical contributions to an old vocal tape. His voice had the power to move listeners to tears even after all these years. When Roy Orbison returned to the music industry, he did more than just return. He orchestrated a comeback unlike any other. At the peak of his rebirth, he departed. His voice locked in a flawless, eerie final note, much like his songs, sad, lovely, and timeless.